Welcome. Welcome to this voiceover of this PowerPoint presentation on egoism. What we have here is a massive PowerPoint, so I'm going to skim through some of this stuff. Alright, we're going to focus on Thomas Hobbes, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Ayn Rand. So we'll talk about some initial goals, some vocabulary, whatnot. Then we will survey these three philosophers' views. We'll go over some critiques of egoism. We'll look at John Hick's evolutionary argument, and then some notes and resources. And yes, there's the Ubermensch right there, the Superman. Alright. I don't know what I just did. But anyway, I'll skip ahead. We're going to talk about those of you who are reading Poyman's book, the late Louis Poyman. I like this guy's text. I agree with about 80% of what he writes in here. But we're going to look at Thomas Hobbes. He talks about him in chapter 1 when he asks the question, why should we be moral? Why do we need morality? And chapter 2, he explores the question, why should I be moral? Is it good for you? And there is a lot to talk about on those pages. So the first question I want you to do in the discussion board is to pick a long quote and explain a section or a point in that chapter and why you find it to be significant, and critique it. Are you pleased with Poyman's presentation and analysis? Where do you agree? Where do you disagree? Where are you not sure yet? And then give us a couple discussion questions to see what we think and if we can work through this thing together. There's a lot in that chapter. I'd start with a conclusion and read that first, and you can work backwards from there. Alright, on page 41. J.L. Mackie, famous atheist of the 20th century, he gives some provocative claim in there. Poyman reports, argues the real name for suckers is Christian. Nietzsche kind of agrees. Nietzsche hates Christian morality, thinks it's the greatest evil that the world's ever created. The quasi-moral syndrome, the parable of the birds, the paradox of egoism, Jesus' statement in Matthew 10:39, and the quote by G.K. Chesterton. Unfortunately, the publisher Wadsworth Thompson did not get that correct. It's G.K., not C.K. And the prisoner's dilemma, John Rawls' quote. There's a lot of stuff in there. So all of us are going to be interested in different topics from this chapter. Just give us something you're interested in and that you find significant, and we'll talk about it, what you want to talk about. All right. The telos, our goal of this presentation, we want to look at these three philosophers and to see what you think about this. Does their description of the moral life, is it partly accurate, wholly accurate? What do they get right? What do they get wrong? All right. What do you think about human nature? What are human beings like? And what follows from these questions? All right. Descriptive and prescriptive. A descriptive claim is just explaining what is. All right. If you give a prescription, you give a normative. So, tougher is sitting is a descriptive statement right now to describe me. Prescriptive would be tougher should not be sitting right now. So anytime you hear a should or an ought, that's prescription. That's being prescriptive. Alright? So, yeah. Descriptions explain what is the case. Prescriptions explain what should or what ought to be the case. Or ought not or should not be the case. Yeah, look. So pause it on here if you're not quite sure about these definitions. And All right, we want to look at description versus prescription. Thomas Hobbes' view of the state of nature, the best and case and worst case scenarios within it, and his compromise. We want to know Nietzsche's view of God and morality. And we want to know Ayn Rand's argument for selfishness, the virtue of selfishness, and see what she gets right and see what she gets wrong. All right. The major types of egoism. We're interested in psychological egoism and universal ethical egoism, which we'll just call ethical egoism in this presentation. All right. Psychological egoism. This is a descriptive theory. In other words, it's not normative or prescriptive. There's no shoulds or oughts about it. This theory just explains the basic psychological fact about human beings. Well, if it's true. Quote, "This is the doctrine that we always do that act that we perceive to be in our own best self-interest. That is, we have no choice but to be selfish. We cannot be motivated by anything other than what we believe will promote our interests. I always try to promote my self-interest, and you always try to promote your self-interest." Now, well, this is years ago, in the June 2007. Today is actually February 5th, 2015. But back in 2007, I heard a woman argue this view. And so, yeah, this psychologist endorsed psychological egoism when she was talking about this guy who acquired TB in Italy and flew back on the plane and possibly infected everybody in it. When that guy flew back from Liberia to Texas and died this year of Ebola, I'm sure some people talked about it then. Can you blame him for doing what everybody would do? We always choose those actions which are in our self-interest. All right. Now, this is a tough debate to solve or figure your way out of it. And the psychologist, it was interesting on this TV show, she kept digging in her heels and says, well, you might not think that you're not doing it for your own self-interest, but there's always hidden psychological desires going on, and so yes. So what I don't like about this, it's just unfalsifiable. I think we actually can look at our own motives and figure this thing out. So I think we can see times in our lives when we were 100% selfish, 50% selfish, and 0% selfish. All right. And we also, Poyman's going to be quick to point out, being selfish and doing things in your own self-interest, how those line up, that's going to be another way possibly out of this. Phoebe and Joey, before you guys were born, there was a TV show called Friends, and you can look at this up on YouTube if you want. So, if we were in class, you can do this on the discussion board if you want. I would have us, it's fun, where one person in a small group will try to present a case from their own life about a purely altruistic act. And, for instance, yes, one time I helped push someone out of a snowdrift, even though I was in a hurry, on my street, Warner Street in Clifton, which is a part of Cincinnati, Ohio, by the University of Cincinnati. And then another person played devil's advocate. You play the psychological egoist and keep asking questions about the altruistic act and try to show that it was done out of purely selfish motives. All right. But do this on the discussion board if you want. Thomas Hobbes, 16th, 17th century. What did he say? He wrote the Leviathan, that's his famous work, where he argued that psychological egoism is a true description of human beings. We are just selfish. And we need to operate within those boundaries, with assuming that to be true. Which, in different decision-making theories, maybe that's not a bad way to go. Alright. He says there's no morality without a contract amongst individuals. Most likely he was an atheist. Some disagree on that. But if you cut out God and what you have is a crazy state of nature. What do we do if everybody's selfish? How do we get out of this mess? We invent morality for our own well-being. Poyman does a good job. If you look at page 7 on this, we can invent morality to keep society from falling apart. Second, to ameliorate human suffering, to promote human flourishing. Fourth, to resolve conflicts of interest in just and orderly ways. And 5, to assign praise and blame, reward and punishment, and guilt. And so, yeah, we should invent morality for all of those reasons. All right. In the Leviathan, he said there's 2 facts that lead to an unstable state. Quote, "From this equality of ability arises a quality of hope in the attaining of our ends." And there's Spartacus the gladiator. Quote, "Hereby it is manifest that during the time men live without a common power to keep them all in awe, they are in that condition which is called war, and such a war as is for every man against every man." So the nature of war consists not in actual fighting, but in the known disposition thereto. During all the time, there is no disposition to the contrary. So it could be like a Cold War. You're not actually fighting, but there you have it. Quote, "In such a condition, there is no place for industry, because the fruit thereof is uncertain, and consequently no cultivating of the earth, no navigation, nor use of the comfortable buildings. No instruments of moving and removing such things as require much force, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no literature, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear, and the danger of violent death, and the life of man solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short." So, they're remaking Mad Max, or doing another edition, so Mad Max Fury Road. I think Channing Tatum is playing Mad Max this time around. But any film where you have a state of nature, yes, in the Mad Max post-apocalyptic world, you don't have time to have a university and that kind of thing. You're walking around with your weapons and you're just trying to stay alive. So, it's like The Walking Dead. That's a better example of a state of nature. Lord of the Flies, a state of nature. If you read that classic or saw that movie, Hurricane Katrina Aftermath. The Walking Dead. So, I'll add this. So, Hobbes' state of nature. So, imagine that a state of nature exists in the world. It's pre-society where no rule of law exists. In our country, we have a constitution. We follow the rule of law. But let's get rid of the government after nuclear war, and it's just chaos. To make Hobbes' thought experiment more clear, imagine that each person in this ultra-primitive society has 3 things. Number 1, a weapon, a ball-peen hammer. Number 2, a bag of jujubes, a possession. And 3, clothing, a loincloth for men. By the way, I got this from my professors at Miami University, Dr. Campbell and Jay Honeywell. So thanks, Dr. Campbell and Jay. All right. Imagine that all day long, everybody in the state of nature tries to hit everybody else on the head and take their jujubes. All right? So, on his view, we're psychological egoists. We are going to do what's going to benefit us best, and we want as many jujubes as possible. That will be a good thing. So, if everybody's running around hiding behind bushes and rocks and trying to hit you on the head and take your box of jujubes, you're going to have a state of nature where life is nasty, brutish, and short. All right? You're just going to try to stay alive and keep your possession. All right, so what do? We've got our weapon, our possession, and there we are. How do we get out of this mess? Now let's look at this. There's a best case and a worst case, and then there's a compromise. The best case is that you become the guy who runs around, or gal, who runs around and just beats 100 people in the head and takes all their jujubes, and you become some warlord or king in your little region, alright? You're like Achilles, you're the strongest and best. Nobody hurts you, and you violate everybody else, and you get as many jujubes as you want, alright? That's the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is that somebody, let's say little Avery, she's sly, she takes her ball-peen hammer and runs up, hits you on the head the first day of the state of nature and takes your jujubes. Alright? Then you lose. So the worst case is that you don't get any jujubes and you get your jujubes stolen. Alright. The compromise is this. Listen, alright, let's all come together and let's make a social contract. Like the U.S. Constitution. Let's just invent these rules. Let's invent morality. Let's say thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not be jealous, and so on, and thou shalt not kill. Wow, let's invent these rules of morality, and let's make a social contract, and everybody's going to pretend everybody else is valuable, and we're all going to follow these rules. Okay? And guess what? Now, it's bad in the sense that you don't get to steal anybody else's stuff, but it's good in the sense that you don't get beat up yourself and have your stuff stolen. So it's a compromise. You don't violate, and you're not violated. Alright, so the social contract is a compromise between the best possible world and the worst possible world. Think about it, and let me know what you think. So in Hobbes' version, we place our trust in a king, an authority to enforce the rules. So in the social contract, we give explicit consent if they're the founders of the contract, and then tacit consent if you live in that kingdom to the king. Alright, and now in this world, life is not as exciting. Alright, if we live in a Mad Max, Walking Dead world, or if you saw the new This Is the End, that film with James Franco, Seth Rogen, and all those clowns. You have an apocalyptic... What's the guy's name from Eastbound and Down? When Channing Tatum is his pet. Anyway, that's... Sure, it's not as fun as having Channing Tatum as your pet, but hey, at least you're not getting beat up yourself. So the fear is removed from life, and we can build buildings, infrastructure, we can pursue the arts. Alright? We're not just trying to survive. As Poyman says, you remain in a cold war under the social contract, always. Alright, so best case scenario in the state of nature, you violate, and you don't get violated. Book of Eli, I like that film. And the road is so depressing, I don't recommend it. But I hear the book's great if you want to be depressed. Alright. Worst case scenario, just a review. You get killed before you steal anybody's stuff. So Kip takes his sai and stabs you and takes your box of jujubes. And it's over. Compromise, you don't violate and you don't get violated. So Nietzsche's going to... It's lame. You're going to live in a boring office space type life in a cube farm. But at least these guys don't live in constant fear of death. Excuse me, life is pleasant and no longer nasty, brutish, and short. What is going on here? Alright. Now let's look at Hollywood's favorite atheist. Kelly Clarkson quotes Nietzsche, "What doesn't kill you makes you stronger." And then you have this kid reading Nietzsche and Little Miss Sunshine. Have you ever seen that film? Oh, I watched this film a month ago over Christmas, 2014, and our favorite governor, Arnold Schwarzenegger, He quotes Nietzsche, the parable of the madman, in German in this film, which could have been better. Struggling, in my view. Alright. Nietzsche, late 19th century, with the best stash you will ever see. There's his mom running away from his stash. Alright. He prided himself as a swashbuckling philosopher, and I think he was right most of the time. If you Human, All Too Human, I like these series of 3 documentaries. Jean-Paul Sartre and Heidegger and Friedrich Nietzsche are surveyed in those. They touch on some other guys there. Alright. Background. You can look it up. But he died in 1900. Mentally insane. Some people think he got caught syphilis from a prostitute. I don't know if it was a Turin, Italy, where Nietzsche was hugging a horse. He just lost it, the poor fella. Alright. We'll skip this. Alright. We'll skip this too. Basically, on modern philosophical naturalism or scientific atheism, some people think that Nietzsche cheated a little bit by inserting some normative elements about human nature, so that actually we should be like this. We should be like animals. We should be like the Vikings. We should be like these people, not have mercy on the disabled, encourage them to commit suicide. And we should be like this. Alright. Shoot, who was it? It was After Virtue. It was in that book. I think this was argued. Alright, but Nietzsche, in contrast to modern philosophical naturalists like Daniel Dennett and Richard Dawkins, advocated a return to minimalist view of human nature, one that strives to satisfy the will to power of the individual. Quote, "What is strong wins. That is the universal law. To speak of right and wrong per se makes no sense at all. No act of violence, rape, exploitation, destruction is intrinsically unjust, since life itself is violent, rapacious, exploitative, and destructive, and cannot be conceived otherwise. You look at the African savannah," well, end quote. "You look at nature, we're just animals, and life is chaotic." I should mention there's different forms of atheism. Excuse me. So most modern atheists, like Daniel Dennett, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, and Christopher Hitchens, those are the 4 horsemen. But Christopher Hitchens unfortunately passed away a few years ago. These guys are philosophical naturalists, scientific materialists. Darwin got rid of all natures, or ways humans ought to be or animals ought to be, with his theory, which just says everything is in flux. So on Darwin's view, there's no teleology. In other words, there's no purposes or goal-directedness in nature. Everything just is an unfolding of nature, and there's nothing is wrong. Nietzsche thinks there's things that are wrong. Okay? So nature, for Darwin, only has the appearance of design. Design and purposes are false. As Daniel Dennett explained, this is Darwin's dangerous idea. So if you ever want to get a grip on what naturalism, consistent naturalism is, I'd read that Daniel Dennett book, Darwin's Dangerous Idea. It's tough, but it's good. And you get clear on this most popular form of atheism. There's other forms of atheism. I mean, Buddhism is an atheist view, but it believes in spiritual elements, non-physical elements. And some forms of earth-based religions, Wicca, are technically atheists. Satanism is technically atheist, but forget all those for this lecture. Yes, there's the main type of atheism today is philosophical naturalism, or scientific atheism. Alright, so Nietzsche differed from Darwin and the other scientific atheists. He had normativity and teleology in his ontology. So it'll be difficult to reconcile with the theory of evolution, some metaphysical baggage that cannot be explained. But email me about that if you want to talk about it. Nietzsche and the Death of God, The Parable of the Madman, and the Gay Science. I wonder if that'll work. Well, listen to it by yourself by Ravi Zacharias. If you just put in YouTube, Ravi Zacharias, Parable of the Madman, it's got a wolf's eyes, and then you can listen to it. Alright. I do love Ravi. He's one of the best. Well, he's now just he's a philosopher, even though I don't think he publishes. But his books, he knows his world religions. He's from India. If you ever want to learn about Christianity and other world religions, you read Ravi Zacharias and listen to him. Best storyteller I know. Alright, we'll skip the Parable of the Madman. Hopefully you'll listen to it on the YouTube. But basically, Nietzsche, he's saying God is dead. European culture in the 19th century had, for all practical purposes, killed God. People went to church and went to potlucks, but God was not as involved, and God was not seen in daily life as the grand architect of the universe. Alright? The secularization of society, that's what was happening. That's what was going on. Alright? So with the rise of secularism, getting God out of the central public square, the dumbing down of the church was a big in the 19th century. In the 20th century, Christians became anti-intellectual and were pushed out of places in the academy or left voluntarily, retired. Fortunately now, I think that in the last 30 years, there's been a revitalization of theistic Christian intellectuals in the academy. You might disagree if that's a good thing. Alright, so the man-made idol God is dead for Nietzsche. We no longer have to hate our souls corrupted by sin or discount the value of our flesh and blood lives. So that's the reality of 19th century Europe. And Soren Kierkegaard lived at the same time as Nietzsche. He saw the same thing, and actually he broke off his engagement to Regina Olsen to write to pagans and Christendom. So Nietzsche was trying to lead people to be consistent with their atheistic beliefs. Kierkegaard was trying to say we should return to our Christian beliefs. Alright, so you're going to have to decide if you find out God doesn't exist, is this a good thing? Are we free at last of God? While Nietzsche, you see clearly in the Parable of the Madman, he's upset. He comes to see that actually it's a good thing. So, quote, "Indeed, we philosophers and free spirits feel, when we hear the news that the old God is dead, as if a new dawn shone on us. Our heart overflows with gratitude, amazement, premonition, expectation. At long last, the horizon appears free to us again, even if it should not be bright. At long last, our ships may venture out again, venture out to face any danger. All the daring of the lover of knowledge is permitted again. The sea, our sea, lies open again. Perhaps there has never yet been such an open sea." Alright, you might want to speculate on the discussion board. Is Nietzsche right? If we get rid of God and we unchain the earth from the sun, what happens? Are we living consistently? And do you think we should have this existential reaction that the madman thinks we should have? Explain your view. And is Nietzsche right about the sailing analogy? You can comment on any of this stuff on the discussion board. Alright, since we're not in class. You know, maybe I should read this. "Have you not heard of the madman who lit a lantern in the bright morning hours, ran to the marketplace, and cried incessantly, 'I seek God! I seek God!' As many of those who did not believe in God were standing around just then, he provoked much laughter. 'Has he got lost?' asked one. 'Did he lose his way like a child?' asked another. 'Or is he hiding? Is he afraid of us? Has he gone on a voyage, emigrated?' Thus they yelled and laughed. The madman jumped into their midst and pierced them with his eyes. 'Whither is God?' he cried. 'I will tell you. We have killed him, you and I. All of us are his murderers. But how did we do this? How could we drink up the sea? Who gave us a sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What were we doing when we unchained this earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now? Whither are we moving? Away from all suns? Are we not plunging continually? Backward, sideward, forward in all directions? Is there still any up or down? Are we not straying as through an infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not become colder? Is not night continually closing in on us? Do we not need to light lanterns in the morning? Do we hear nothing as yet of the noise of the gravediggers who are here burying God? Do we smell nothing as yet of the divine decomposition? God's too decomposed. God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. How should we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood off us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement? What sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it? There has never been a greater deed, and whoever is born after us, for the sake of this deed, he will belong to a higher history than all history hitherto. Here the madman fell silent and looked again at his listeners, and they too were silent and stared at him in astonishment. At last he threw his lantern on the ground, and it broke into pieces and went out. I have come too early, he said then. My time is not yet. This tremendous event is still on its way, still wandering. It has not yet reached the ears of men. Lightning and thunder require time. The light of the stars requires time. Deeds, though done, still require time to be seen and heard. This deed is still more distant from them than the most distant stars, and yet they have done it themselves. It has been related further that on the same day the madman forced his way into several churches and there struck up his Requiem Aeternam Deo. Let out and called to account, he is said always to have replied nothing but, What after all are these churches now if they are not tombs and sepulchres of God? The will to power, Nietzsche's famous theory, triumph of the will. So with the God out of the equation, Nietzsche concludes it is our own will to power, the human drive to push onward, that drives human beings to exceed limits and constraints to achieve. So the goal of human beings is manifested by self-overcoming and self-mastery. The will to power is natural and life-affirming, the yes to life. All right, as one of my professors said, he said the greatest piece of 20th century propaganda was a Leni Riefenstahl film about Hitler called Triumph of the Will. In it, Hitler is painted as a Nietzschean Superman, the Übermensch. All right. So, if you watch this film, I watched it as an undergraduate. My majors were history and political science, and I took 3 classes on Nazi Germany. But, yeah, you know better. But if you were a German, you can easily conceive of Germans seeing this and cheering for Hitler. It opens where he's flying through the clouds, and then you see him getting off a plane, and you see him going down the street, and the crowds of people are just thronging to him, screaming and crying, women, babies, and men. And so everybody is excited about this guy. You can watch the beginning on YouTube and think about it. Power propaganda. All right, master versus slave morality. Basically, this goes back to, hey, who are the heroes we should celebrate? We should celebrate the Vikings. All right? These guys, wine, women, war, and song, they were self-disciplined. They worked out. They learned their craft. And so, I think that Nietzsche's ideal world would be like a Game of Thrones world. All right? Power, appropriation, stealing, that type of thing. So, the master moralists are psychologically powerful, strong-willed individuals, nobles not interested in conforming to social conventions. They worship power in all of its forms. Alright? So the slave moralists condemn the virtues and unbridled achievements of the master moralists, and so they create a reaction against the values of the powerful. And they invent a morality that's contrary to human nature as animals, the Viking morality. And the best example is the Christian church. Alright? He thinks the example of pity is horrible that Christians have invented. And for us to have the pity on the poor and the weak and all this stuff he thinks is horrible. Alright? And an example of this is that if we go back to the medieval era and you have the pipsqueak tiny priest who forces the swarthy knight to kneel and take communion. Nietzsche thinks this is an inversion of values, and what should happen is for that knight to just grab the priest by the neck, throw him out the window, and take his own communion. So slave morality, Christian morality, is not life-affirming, but life-denying. So yeah, Nietzsche versus Christianity. He said he regards it as the most fatal and seductive lie that has ever existed, as the greatest and most impious lie. So if you read the Antichrist online, all this stuff's online, you'll see his view of Christianity pretty quick. He says it over and over again and again. Alright. So I loved this Al Pacino's tirade in the film The Devil's Advocate. It's straight out of Nietzsche, basically. So, where Al Pacino, he plays Lucifer, Satan, and he explains why he's a fan of man and God is cruel to give humans these desires and these rules where they can't act on these desires. Alrighty. A note of interest is Superman, this Ubermensch. That was Nietzsche's ideal for humanity. And so we hear this mention. Lois Lane in the CW series Smallville quoted Nietzsche in the last season. And yeah. Radical postmodernism. Postmodernism is a fishy thing to define, but for our purposes, radical postmodernism says that there are no universal truths. There are no meta-narratives. Everything is a story from somewhere, and rationality and reason are dismissed. Everything has psychological, non-rational causes. Alright? Dallas Willard, the late Dallas Willard, who I think is the best philosopher if you want to read about spiritual development. This is the guy to check out. dwillard.org. I had a class from him back in the spring of 1997 at Biola University. Basically what Dallas Willard said in that class to me was, in a lecture, Nietzsche ate the whole bag of phenomenalism or positivism. If you can't touch it, taste it, smell it, or hear it, you don't know it. And Willard said that, yes, Nietzsche argued everything is irrational. The ironic thing is, to quote Willard, it's always a good thing to do if you're going to be irrational, is to give a good reason for it. So it's kind of self-refuting to argue everything is irrational with reason itself. So, for Nietzsche, the patron saint of irrationalism, everything is an expression of power, not of reason. Even truth is oppressive. Logic becomes a male conspiracy. And reason itself is part of a problem because reason is formed by the people in power. Now, everybody can admit there's some truth to the last point. People in power write the textbooks. The scientists in power tell us which theories to believe. They hire the professors. They select articles for journals. And so it's a sociological fact that people in power get to dictate. Parents, teachers, they dictate what counts as knowledge or not to some degree. But I think we can stress that there are lines, and that eventually the truth will emerge in many respects, as John Stuart Mill said. All right, so on the discussion board, tell us what you think of Nietzsche's philosophy, what do you agree with, what do you disagree with. There you go. There's my stupid selfie. I lost my jacket. That's my Saint-Étienne jacket. But I was in Nice a year and a half ago, watching Rafa and Joker, and staying at a hostel. There was a former monastery in Nice. There's Old Nice. There's, if you climb this big hill, you can see the main beast at Nice. Nietzsche lived there for a while. You can go to his house, and you can see his path, or the Nietzsche walk, where you used to go. Alright. Ayn Rand. Hollywood also loves Ayn Rand. I haven't seen these Atlas Shrugged movies, but I hear there's Atlas Shrugged 1, 2, and 3. Fountainhead was done in early 60s. Alright. AynRand.org. They're still big followers of Ayn Rand, who wrote The Virtue of Selfishness. She was born in Russia, and she came to the U.S. after the Russian Revolution, and she's always arguing against communism and Marxism in all of her writings. So she's taken as the opposite of the communist or the state, a large state, economic justice policies. And libertarians like Ayn Rand, maybe not in personal ethics, but at least when it comes to broader economic policies. Alright. You can pause and read what she said about these philosophers. It's confusing. Moral realism and moral objectivism, those stand in contrast to moral nihilism or nihilism and moral relativism. But she co-opts and uses this term objectivism for her philosophy, so don't be confused. There's two types of objectivism. So Rand's objectivist ethics, she says selfishness is not evil. So most of us equate selfishness with evil. A person who pursues nothing but immediate gratification of mindless whims and momentary desires. But Rand challenges this conventional understanding of the term selfish. She argues that our failure to understand the concept has led to arrested moral development of humankind. Alright? She thinks reason can guide us to determine these principles. So, morality must be consistent with one's rational self-interest and selfishness. So, the virtue of selfishness, in this book she argues the objectivist, or someone who follows her view, the objectivist ethics holds that the actor must always be the beneficiary of his action. Quote, that which is proper to the life of a rational being is the good. That which negates, opposes, or destroys it is evil. And so the view to be abhorred is called altruism. Quote, any action taken for the benefit of others is good, and any action taken for one's own benefit is evil. Thus, the beneficiary of an action is the only criterion of moral value. As long as the beneficiary is anybody older than oneself, anything goes. Altruism is suicidal. Quote, if a man accepts the ethics of altruism, his first concern is not how to live his life, but how to sacrifice it. Altruism erodes men's capacity to grasp the value of an individual life. It reveals a mind from which the reality of a human being has been wiped out. Altruism holds death as its ultimate goal, its standard of value, and it is logical that renunciation, resignation, self-denial, and every form of suffering, including self-destruction, are the virtue of its advocates. What do you guys think? Is Ayn Rand right to some degree? Now think about what Rand says and think about your life and the people you know. Have you yourself or have you seen people sacrifice their lives for others and deny themselves their own goals and interests? Has it made them bitter, especially if the recipient of the sacrifice was not grateful? What do you guys think? So everybody's seen, the mom in the Christmas story, Ralphie says, my mother had not had a hot meal in 30 years because she's always getting up and serving everybody at the table. Is that the case? Do you have a mother or father or a grandparent or somebody at work you know who's always doing stuff for everybody, but she actually suffers because people are not givers like she is or he. They're takers. And so all these takers at work or in the family leave the caregiver underappreciated, undervalued, and is that person's soul destroyed as a result? So Ayn Rand thinks that, listen, if you enable behavior, so parents, often enable kids bad behavior. You see this in relationships where one spouse is enabled by the other, so that bad behavior is enabled. What do you think? How many people abuse welfare in this country? So Rand's going to argue welfare not only hurts the recipient, but hurts the individuals giving welfare, and nobody wins. So what do you think? Enabling welfare abuse and sacrifices in your own family? Tell us what you think on the discussion board. Altruism for Rand is inhumane. Any collectivist thinking is like a Marxist thinking where the state provides a lot of things. So heavy taxation, or even Marxism, communism, where the state owns the means of production and the fruits of the labor and everything's distributed equally. Or to a degree, our society is collectivist in that we have all these entitlements, Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, which actually you pay into, so technically it's not necessarily an entitlement, and welfare, education, that kind of thing. Alright, so any collectivist or Marxist thinking which requires the individual to sacrifice personal interest for the benefit of the group, society, or state, which is the ethic of altruism, is ultimately destructive, Rand thinks. So the beneficiary criterion of morality, which doing for others is good, doing only for oneself is bad, she thinks is grotesque and absurd. Dutifully sacrificing for others and hoping that others will dutifully sacrifice for oneself breeds mutual resentment. It doesn't breed pleasure or happiness. Think about that. Altruism transforms people into sacrificial animals, those who are giving of themselves and victims, and profiteers on sacrifice, those gladly accepting offerings and parasites. So this does not permit room for those who wish to live their lives by sacrificing neither themselves nor others. What do you guys think? Is Rand right to some degree? Draw on your knowledge of collectivist theories, socialist and communist countries, and somewhat collectivist policies in our own country, welfare, healthcare, education, and is she right? Do you know of people who have abused welfare? Do welfare abusers live poorer lives because they are not working for themselves and using their gifts and talents? Get into groups and see if you can defend Rand's views. So chances are, most of you will agree to a certain degree. Yes, there's always some taker in the family who is enabled by other people, whether the welfare comes from parents or from the state and government or that. But there's always some people who actually legitimately can use it. But you decide. For Rand, the view of human beings as either victims or parasites allows for no acceptable concept of justice, nor the possibility of benevolent coexistence among equals. It breeds only cynicism and guilt. So she's actually combining her philosophy with some sociology and psychology here to see the effects. She thinks cynicism is produced because they neither practice nor accept altruistic morality. Guilt because they dare not reject it because of the peril of rejecting the collectivist herd, waiting for your sacrificial offering. Ayn Rand says this: the basis of morality must come from human nature. On Rand's objectivist ethics, the actor must always be the beneficiary of his action. Our only code of values should be those to save civilization. Morality should only be a choice between existence and non-existence. Life is a process of self-sustaining and self-generated action. It is this life that gives humanity its goals. One cannot meaningfully discuss the concept of value outside the context of life, and we make our value judgments in order to secure our survival, our nature. Continued existence is the purpose of valuing. Value is that which one acts to gain and or keep. Virtue is the act by which one gains and or keeps. So the virtues of rationality, productivity, and pride. Values, reason, purpose, self-esteem. Reason is the only source of knowledge and guide to action, to live by the work of one's own mind. Productive work is the process by which man's mind supports and sustains life, encompasses the most complete and purposeful use of the mind. Pride is something one earns by working towards one's own moral perfection. We are required to reject any philosophy, doctrine, or religion that preaches self-denial as a virtuous moral duty, to reject any role of sacrificial animal. So Rand's going to have some huge issues with Christianity and the ethic of Jesus here. Rational selfishness. Quote, the principle of trade is the only rational ethical principle for all human relationships, personal and social, private and public, spiritual and material. It is the principle of justice. So, she preaches the value of being a true trader. Life is the irreducible primary, and it is in support of life that all rational value judgments can be made. Happiness is the purpose of ethics, but not the standard. It is not in one's rational interest to injure, enslave, rob, or murder others. Therefore, it is the true trader who earns what they get and refuses to take the undeserved. Traders deal with each other as equals. One can be a trader in business or a trader in friendship, admiration, or in a spiritual transaction such as love relationships. So I think a lot of us can agree with this to some degree. People want friends that are enjoyable to be around. So whether it's, friendships are based on different things. But some of my friends, they like to do philosophy. So I really enjoy those friendships. They're rich because we do philosophy and we'll argue 25 hours a week, with each other. That's fun, and that's being a true trader. If you're not a true trader, one friend's a taker and one's a giver, and they're not equals. One's giving, one's taking. So whether it's wit, whether it's intellect, love relationship, do you balance each other out? Do you hold each other accountable? The proverb, just as iron sharpens iron, so does one man sharpen another. Does that proverb ring true? In a way, this is a biblical principle. But there are limits, I think, and real problems. But you be the judge yourself. Is Rand right about these relationships? What about her virtue of rational selfishness? So the group discussion on the DB discussion board. What do you think? Talk about the friends that weigh you down and suck the life or money out of you and never return anything. Have you had to end some friendships because you were the only giver and your friend was just a taker? I would recommend reading Henry Cloud and John Townsend's book, Boundaries. I've read the book Boundaries in Dating with like 8 ex-girlfriends, and they're fantastic. Boundaries is just a general book. There's boundaries in marriage, boundaries with kids, But boundaries, these are great books to know when we should draw a line and not be a doormat if people are taking advantage of us, when we're enabling others' behavior, or we're allowing others to enable our own bad behavior. And it's all about healthy relationships. So, think about that. Also, the role of government, not just individual ethics, Rand mentions. She thinks government's only purpose is to protect human rights and allow for laissez-faire capitalism. Without property rights, no other rights are possible. Society is only a number of individual men, and it is government's only job to protect the lives, property, and right to pursue individual happiness. So, in some major extent, the Founding Fathers would agree with her, and this is why the Tea Party holds up sands of Ayn Rand in this respect. So, yeah, the Founding Fathers thought we had God-given rights to pursue happiness within boundaries, and the government should be established to protect those God-given rights and protect human freedom. And so, yeah, that's it. Government's job is not to be a collectivist, entitlement, welfare state. So this is a few years ago, 15 April 2009, when the Tea Party was born. There you have this. So yeah, her economic political philosophy is not dead. Her view is often in direct conflict with the Obama administration's political philosophy of the role of government to provide positive rights for people. Alright, once you pause it and read Poyman's argument here yourself. Why does this do this? Oh, you know what? It's the design. No. Layout. Okay. Critiques of egoism. I think I'm approaching an hour here, so I'm going to rush through this last bit. Poyman, look at Poyman's arguments. He's done a good job critiquing Rand in multiple ways. His one major point is there might be a false dilemma, which is an informal fallacy, between absolute altruism and absolute egoism. And Poyman also says that Rand does not distinguish between self-interest and selfishness in her work. So self-interest is concerned to promote our own good, but not at all costs. Selfishness is sacrifice the good of others from our own good. So, yeah, there are a lot of things could be self-interested that might appear selfish, but are not. And another thing that you can mention, Poyman says, Randian egoism would not produce biblical heroes like the Good Samaritan, or American heroes like Patrick Henry or Nathan Hale. So look up that passage in the chapter 2 and discuss that. What do you think? Maybe you can save Rand's view and argue that it might. And fourth critique, Randian egoism seems to take as absolutes our own happiness or continued life. But these do not seem to be absolute values. So Poyman here seems to be echoing the view that that there might be some things worse than dying. Alright. To quote Robert Duvall in the film Open Range. Alright. What's going on here? Alright. I'm not going to go over these really. You can read them and see what you think on the discussion board. Oh, I forgot about this one. It is interesting if people should adopt a universal ethical egoism. What sense does it make to teach this or write books on it? Why did Nietzsche try to persuade others to adopt his philosophy, since it may lead to his own death? So it seemed to me makes more sense to keep quiet and just follow your own ethical egoist morality. This is another thing Poyman brings up. What do you guys think? Could the egoist ever have true friends? Is deep friendship compatible with universal ethical egoism? Isn't some altruism required for friendship? Maybe, maybe not. Talk about true traitors and that type of thing. Like, it was interesting in, what was it, X-Men 2 or 3, when Magneto dropped Mystique off once she became, when she actually had her mutation removed by that serum, and Magneto just said forget it and left her. Alright. Argument for intuitive consequences. Egoism is an absolute ethics that demands egotistic behavior versus simply permitting it. Helping others at one's own expense is not simply optional, it is actually morally wrong. And if I can save the whole of Europe and Africa from destruction by pressing a button, then as long as there is nothing for me to gain by it, it is wrong for me to press that button. But Poyman says it's certainly hard to see why the egotist should be concerned about environmental matters if he or she is profiting from polluting the environment. I think this, I made this up, the argument from Les Miserables. So Victor Hugo's work, you can read it online there or watch the clip from the film. The clip from the film I have on here is Liam Neeson. And I cry every time I watch this. This kind of mercy and grace given by this priest, I think, is unbelievable. And so for me, as someone who's following Jesus, or trying to, as a Christian theist, I have a real problem with Randian ethics if it would eliminate these cases of grace and mercy on people. So yeah, the Les Miserables argument. I actually dated a girl, back in 2006, and it was so interesting. The first night of dinner I had with her parents and brother, it was like, I loved it. It felt like, I don't know, it was 100 years earlier, because after dinner, no TV was turned on. Every child took turns playing a tune on the piano for everybody else after dessert. And then we went into the study, and then everybody in the family went and pulled a book off the shelf and read quotes out of the book, or a passage. And my girlfriend's mother read this passage of the Bishop and Jean Valjean from Les Miserables. And I sat there, and I was teaching this at the time, and I was like, wow, that's a great argument against Rand's ethic. Alright, so what do you guys think? Can egoism be saved? Think about it and discuss it on the discussion board. Alright. So, John Hick, he actually gave an argument for why we should be ethical egoists if evolution is how we got here and there is no God behind evolution. So Hick said this: without the anchor of theism, or the belief in God as architect and enforcer of morality, morality becomes very difficult to justify. As Poyman struggles in chapter 1 and 2, yes, why and how should we be moral? Why does morality make sense? Why I should choose a moral life versus an immoral life? It's not a no-brainer. And why should we value other human beings if they're just animals and magnificent meat machines produced by a random process called evolution? So these are big questions. Why should we be moral? Why should we care? So, without the anchor of theism, in other words, God as architect and enforcer of morality, morality becomes very difficult to justify. So if we assume the current worldview of scientific atheism or philosophical naturalism, our moral intuitions are the product of blind evolutionary processes. We don't discover moral principles on scientific naturalism. They don't exist, so we invent them, or they're relative. So the question becomes, Hicks says, why should we obey these irrational moral instincts? Why should we care about society that hurt more than myself? So if we realize our moral beliefs when we feel bad when someone kicks a puppy, or we get angry when ISIS beheads somebody or sets somebody on fire, those moral instincts and actions are just ingrained in us thanks to this evolutionary process. Alright, plus environment. But why should we trust these emotional responses and these moral judgments if everything about us is produced by this process of evolution, and really all humans are magnificent meat machines? So John Hick says this. He asks us to imagine that an ant is taught the truths of sociobiology, or evolutionary theory, and to also imagine that this ant has free will. Quote, suppose him to be called upon to kill himself or immolate himself for the sake of the anthill. He feels the powerful pressure of instinct pushing him towards a self-destruction. But he asks himself, why should he voluntarily carry out the suicidal program to which instinct prompts him? Why should he regard the future existence of a million other ants more important to him than his own continued existence? Since all that he is and has or ever can have is his own present existence, surely insofar as he is free from the domination of the blind force of instinct, he will opt for his own life. His own life. So, Hick is arguing that there's not one bit of rationality behind moral instincts that encourage altruistic behavior. The ant is programmed to kill himself for the rest of the anthill. But the ant's desire and feeling that it's right to kill himself for the sake of the anthill, that's just evolutionary programming. There's no truth out there that that's his duty. So in light of other concerns, namely there's no afterlife, there's no intrinsic value to other living things, John Hick thinks that it is irrational to obey non-egoistic moral instincts. So it's irrational not to care about yourself more than others. So, just like Ted Bundy chose to ignore morality, grounded in the opinions of the culture, and opt for his own self-interest, naturalism also provides no rational basis for morality, and people should pursue their own self-interest. Alright. So, what do you think of John Hick's argument? We're going to deal with this again when we talk about religion and ethics till we're sick of it. But think about what he says and if you buy it. Since a lot of us don't think about, wow, if there is no God, what are the implications of this? Most of us are still like the world the madman was trying to wake up. And personally, I think that's a big problem. I see on TV all day long atheists, or philosophical naturalists, scientific atheists, who help themselves to all this stuff that do not make sense on the worldview of naturalism. And I scream at the TV 10 times a day. I'm like, really? Okay, if there is no God, then nothing is wrong in the world. We get rid of free will. We get rid of morality and these type of things. So the best we can do is, on my view, a Hobbes type scenario, where yeah, you invent morality and you make a social contract and you enforce it, then nothing is really wrong. Alright. I could be wrong about it, but let's talk about it on the discussion board. And there you go. So, but naturalists, that's why I think reading Dennett is so important. Daniel Dennett's book, Darwin's Dangerous Idea, because you really see the implications of naturalism. If everything about human beings is just a product of matter rearranging, and all human beings are magnificent meat machines, or atoms moving in clouds of force. Alright, ants. So, to review for your midterm, when we come to that point, distinguish the prescriptive theory, ethical egoism, from the descriptive theory, psychological egoism. Be able to explain the state of nature and talk about with jujubes, ball peen hammer, and then talk about Nietzsche's point in the parable of the madman, and then be able to defend Rand's argument for the virtue of selfishness over altruism, and tell us what the Les Mis objection is, and Poyman's critiques. So, with everything this course, we want you to do the best to argue for the view and know the best arguments against the view. As John Stuart Mill says, this is the best way for us to pursue the truth. Know our opponent's arguments, the best arguments for a view, know the arguments against a view, throw it all on the table and work through it, try to find out what's most reasonable to believe. So finding where you agree with all these guys and disagree is very important. And be able to explain John Hick's ant argument. Alright, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is online. You can look up Hobbes on there, Nietzsche, and Rand. See Phil Donahue interview Ayn Rand, Scene from the Fountainhead, watch Superman movies. And I don't know if they still have this, but you can win $10,000 if they still do this Ayn Rand objectivist essay. There you have it. Adam Smith. Trainspotting, one of my favorite films. They're doing a sequel with Danny Boyle. Alright. By the way, Adam Smith and capitalism. People forget that Adam Smith wrote the Theory of Moral Sentiments as well, in addition to his economic books. And so he was an ethicist philosopher. And yeah, we have to have good people, good moral people, in order for any system to work. So every theory of government, every political philosophy, on my view, you have to deal with human sin. I think that's the problem with Marx and a lot of these top-down people. Some people call statist, where the state's more important than individuals. And I think that's a problem with the French Revolution, the Rousseau Revolution versus the American Revolution, which relied on John Locke, a Christian philosophy, versus Rousseau, where you can remake human nature from the top down. So, this Marxist, the Jacobin, or the Rousseauian French Revolution top-down approach, where you can remake human nature and everybody's fine with the perfect government, I think is just false. I think you always have to deal with human sin or human evil and selfishness. Psychological egoism, to a degree, is true. And so, yeah, I think that's why we have separation of powers in this country. But I think our founding fathers were trying to deal with the problem of sin to a large degree, and to avoid tyranny. So, yeah, you don't want to give one man all the power. You want to spread out power, checks and balances, so we can avoid, tyranny and the problem of sin. Alright. So, capitalism is not inherently evil, is my point. Now, and the worse people are, the worse capitalism can be, but many people argue it's a good way to channel selfishness. Alright. Go watch Trainspotting. I'll see you guys, signing off from Mason, Ohio, 5 February 2015. Alrighty. I don't know how to shut this off. Alright, bye.